They record.
Yeah.
All right.
It's in.
And let's see if we can get into show mode here.
Being recorded. Okay.
I'm glad you remembered.
All right.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Eleanor Rangers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving history through the memories of those who created it. We're an organization that started in 2010, primarily collecting oral histories of people involved in Cold War-related activities in the Southeastern Pennsylvania area. But over the years, we've expanded our activities to include educational programming like this webinar. So I just have a couple of announcements before we turn things over to our guest speaker this evening.
Why advance again?
So this is our History in Our Backyard webinar series, of course, for those of you familiar. We've run these programs since 2012, originally live programming exclusively in Warminster, Pennsylvania, about 5 times a year. But with the pandemic, we extended it into a webinar series that's been quite successful. And now we're back to doing kind of a combination of webinar and live events again.
How do I bring up?
Don't worry.
As a nonprofit organization, we certainly rely on the donations and generosity of people that are interested in supporting our organization. So if you so choose, please keep us in mind for any donations. I do want to give a shout out to those who generously contributed to our organization this past Giving Tuesday, right after Thanksgiving. So very much appreciate that. It's always welcome, and any donations strictly go to any programming and some other activities that we're involved with. With the museum. Sorry, I just popped myself out of that. Okay. Also, just so you know, we do have a YouTube channel where we do keep a number of Cold War related videos. We also house recordings of these lectures. If you wanted to re-listen to them, or if you missed a lecture, we do house those on there. I do try to keep that channel updated periodically, so it's great to check it out, a couple of times a year just to see about any new content. We also do have a Facebook page. If any of you are on that platform, feel free to look us up. I do try to post any of the events that we have there, and I do post some other Cold War and space race related articles of interest on that page as well. And speaking of programming, this is actually our 2025 webinar and live lecture series. Just completed scheduling this, and I did send an announcement out for this, but we actually are going to continue with the series starting in January of 2025. I'm actually kind of excited. For those of you who have been regular attendees to these programs, we've actually had George Leopold actually live in Warminster to talk about Gus Grissom, his book about Gus Grissom a couple of years ago. And then he was back with another individual, Andy Saunders, to talk about a follow-up to that lecture. But he is back now in January with Matthew Bedingfield, a colleague, and both of them are working on a new book about the Apollo 1 fire. And I'm really looking forward to that presentation. So definitely one not to be missed. You can see that we kind of front loaded a number of space race topics in the front end of the year, but then we have a good mix of Cold War related presentations starting in April and then going through the latter part of the year. So definitely join us for 2025. Really looking forward to the presentations. And that's our little plug about January 9th, and you will see some announcements go out if you're on our email distribution list.
You ready?
So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker this evening, Jean Wright. Now, Jean Wright actually is a retired NASA Aerospace Composite Technician, and she worked for United Space Alliance, and she was one of 18 women in this critical role of composite technician. And she and her coworkers, who dubbed their group the So Sisters, were responsible for fabrication, assembly, disassembly, installation, and repair of the thermal protection system hardware and blankets to protect space shuttles Atlantis, Discovery, and Endeavour and their astronaut occupants from deadly perilous reentry, heat, and radiation. She also worked on test parachutes and aft-skirt blankets for the Orion spacecraft. Jean has been invited to present at many prestigious events, including the International Quilt Festival in Houston, Texas, the Northeast Astronomy Forum, known as NEAF, in New York, the MQX Machine Quilters Exposition in New Hampshire, Women's History Month at Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, Family Day at Udvar-Hazy National Air and Space Museum, and at Space Fest. And she has conducted many TV, radio, and online interviews and has been featured in multiple magazine and newspaper articles, often as a so-called hidden figure in the space industry. So with that, I'm going to exit my presentation and turn things over to Jean Wright to talk about her work on thermal protection with the shuttles.
All righty.
All right, here. Well, I'm going to just
We're going to start it now. Here we go.
share this screen, hopefully.
Okay. What's wrong? There we go.
Okay. And also, if folks could mute themselves and go off camera just to reserve bandwidth, that would be helpful. But we can open up the lines for Q&A at the end.
Starting there. Hold on. I don't know. Hold on.
Okay, the floor is yours, Jean.
Thank you. Just take us a second here.
No worries.
Okay.
All right. Do
There
you
we
see her first slide here?
Can you see
Now,
it?
now we can, yes.
Okay.
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 Good.
How do I advance it? Right here?
Yeah, just forward back.
Okay. All righty. So this is the title of my presentation, Needle to Nebulas. I wanted something catchy for it. And in the slide you see here, I have one of our orbiters getting ready to go into the vehicle assembly building. There's a picture of me with my Sew Sister book with the VAB in the background. The little patch that you see there is our official Sew Sister patch. The symbolic meaning of it is you see a lady sewing there and there's 5 gold stars above her head, and each of those gold stars represents each of our space shuttles. Tim Gagnon designed it for us a number of years ago, and it's been a very well received patch. So I've had the honor of being a docent, the very first docent, along with our bay manager, Terry White. We were selected to be the first official docents to escort people and give tours at the Space Shuttle Atlantis when the exhibit opened up in June of 2013. It's a very popular exhibit and it's a very beautiful exhibit. Kind of funny because the angle that we have it at is at 43.21 degrees, and everybody asked specifically, what does that mean? And Louis Barrios, who designed the building, said he wanted something quirky. We have enough educational stuff. I wanted something fun. So it's for the 4, 3, 2, 1 countdown, which is why the Atlantis is at the angle that it is. Kind of cool, I think. There we go. And it's funny because when I was a docent up at the Atlantis exhibit, I happened to meet Elise Maddock with her and her husband and her family. She said that she wanted to start a series of books of women that had like we had mentioned, Eleanor had mentioned, a hidden figures type of story. And so she herself, along with a number of other people, have no idea how the shuttle has been covered with fabric since 1988, a long time. And so over the course of the time during COVID, we called each other back and forth and messaged each other. And so she wrote the book, and it's been very well received. We've had a lot of astronauts who did blurbs for it. And Michael Leinbach, our launch director, told me years ago, if the book ever comes to fruition, I'd be honored to be the first one to write a blurb for the book. And he kept his word, and he did it. And he's in the bottom right-hand corner. And then, of course, there's Nicole Stott. She wrote one. And Bob Cabana, he didn't write a blurb, but he's always been one of my biggest supporters. So let me go next. Anyway, so here's the picture up in the upper left-hand corner. That's that's Atlantis getting ready to roll for the last time in the VAB. That was part of my team. That encompasses a lot of the people that were in our thermal protection facility, the people that built the tile, logistics, people that did heat cleaning, some of the ladies that worked with me, my sew sisters. And in the upper right-hand corner is some of my sew sisters were not all there, but I still remember all their names because we had a lot. We were very proud of the work that we did. And as you can see, about the bottom picture, that's the TPSF. The side where you see the blue filters, everybody knows about the tile, and that's the end of the building where the tiles were made. And as you can see in the background, the two-story portion, that's the portion we ladies worked in. We were upstairs. Oh, I'm sorry? Oh, yes, they were in the book. Yes, they have pictures of them inside the book. Sorry. Okay, there we go. And oops, sorry, I don't know how that jumped. There we go. And again, that just shows the process of there's Endeavor on the top, and it's just that we're having rollover. It was amazing how close we were to the center of activity. When I said we took our parts across the street, we literally did, because Bay over OPF, Orbital Processing Facility, bays 1 and 2 are directly across the street from our building, and bay 3 would be on the left side if you were looking out the front door. So we were very close in the thick of everything, and the VAB literally was just a kitty corner from our parking lot. So we were right in the thick of things in our building. So one of the highlights, besides working on the shuttle, a number of years ago when they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of walking on the moon back in 2018, I had the Armstrong brothers, Mark Armstrong in particular, called me and said he had a special project he wanted me to work on. The movie First Man was getting ready to come out, and they wanted a way to celebrate their father's achievements. So I went down to Sarasota, and lo and behold, my surprise was the fabric from the 1903 Wright Flyer that Neil Armstrong, Armstrong took to the moon, and they asked me to cut it in 218 pieces for auction. Some of it went to the family for profit, I suppose, and the other one they gave a bunch of donation. They donated a bunch of money, and as I'm cutting the pieces, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, as I was cutting the pieces, they were putting them in these little plastic cases. You see how awful the fabric looked. Fabric was stored in a shed for a number of years, and then they had a flood in Dayton, and the fabric was exposed to coal dust and rust and mildew, and some of the fabric was very fragile for me to cut. Just out of curiosity, if you're interested, the pieces that I cut 1.25 inches by 1.25 inches sold for $275,000 a piece. And the pieces that I cut, they were roughly 3/4 by 3/4. Those went to between 95 and 175,000 a piece. Touching history, but I literally cried. I had tears in my eyes when I saw the fabric because I couldn't believe I would be lucky enough or honored enough to be able to touch it. People asked me, "Did you touch the fabric?" And I said, technically no, but when they put a piece of fabric in a casing, there were 3 threads that popped out. And the gentleman who worked at the auction house told me, "Jean, you can take your glove on and you can tickle those fibers and say that you touched the fabric." So I did. Yeah.
And Jean, you're related to the Wright brothers, is that correct?
Oh, no, no,
No?
there's a possibility. It was by marriage how I have my name, but my late husband's family had settled in Ohio. So there's a small chance that maybe so, not me personally, but indirectly by marriage. Yes. So there we go. I already did that. So here, getting back to my building, people are amazed when I tell them the amount of hand sewing that we did on Shuttle, because they'll say to me, "You worked with a needle and thread?" I said, "Honestly, with a needle and thread." So the examples that I have here on the table, we had a lot of people that would come in our building all the time doing tours. So we always had this pretty much on permanent display, just some of the work of the objects that we built by hand. In the center, those are horse collars. Those we would fold into a rectangle and put in the leading edge of the wings. Some of the other ones are thrusters. In the back, you have that oval, that's a thruster. Again, you'd be amazed at the amount of pieces that we did by hand. You can also see a bulletin board in the bottom right-hand corner that we have on display. And again, the majority of those pieces on display we physically did with a needle and thread. So even though I worked on the shuttle, there are a lot of areas that we worked on. And so when I say that I literally worked from the top of the shuttle down to the very bottom, I'm not exaggerating. You can see the solid rocket boosters, you see the orbiter itself, you see the external tank. Well, you can see on the picture on the right, you'll see, well, it's kind of cut off, but we had a GOX hose that went from the surface structure to the actual orbiter itself. And on occasion, the best way to describe that, it looked like a hose that you would have on the back of a dryer. And I would have to go up on that level, even though I was afraid of heights. And I would have to physically hand sew patches on that GOX hose because it was constantly being exposed to elements. So it's a hard part of the hose, but as you get closer to the orbiter, it's a pleated piece of fabric. And I also down at the bottom, and we'll talk about that later, we also did the engine blankets. So we went from top to bottom on the shuttle that we worked. The picture that I have at the bottom, that was taken as the shuttle was landing at Kennedy. The historical purpose of that, I have the picture. I did work in the parachute facility for a year, building Orion test parachutes and also repairing the shuttle chute, which is 40 feet across if you're interested. The very first shuttle to have a parachute was Endeavour back on STS-49. What a miracle that was. It not only slowed it down drastically when it landed, it helped the tires when it landed, and it also cut by half the length of time or length that it did for it went to engine stop. And there's me inside Discovery. We used to have to put on that very stylish outfit whenever we went on board. I was fortunate enough that sometimes I was able to go on board literally as 4 hours after she landed, because we would be inspecting things. We had this tradition that we had a white room before we had to go into the shuttle, and we all would sign our names. So I have my name on all of them with my name and so sister. But we had a tradition. We had this giant floor rug that was basically white tape, and we used to call it our happy dance because we knew we were getting ready to go inside the shuttle. We had these knee-high boots, but we would do what we called a happy dance to get all the dirt and debris off our feet. And then we knew it was official. We were getting ready to go inside the shuttle. So that's always an exciting time. And you can see we have the crew compartment down in there, flight deck, very complicated. I'm sitting in the pilot seat. It's very small up there. It's smaller than what you think it is. Here we go. So there's my building again. I also have a couple of pictures that I have on that you can see. I have a lot of questions that people ask me what it looks upstairs, and it's a whole conglomerate of multi machines. We've got big machines, small machines, old machines, every brand you can pretty much think of. Singer itself, a lot of Singer. We have a lot of history with Singers. Excuse me. Wright Brothers used the Singers. We had the seamstresses that worked on the Apollo suits, and also at the when they shuttle. Excuse me, when the spacesuits were at ILC Dover. Their names were Big Mo and Sweet Sue, and we've kept that tradition. All of our sewing machines have a name, and that was that tradition started in the mid-60s with the Apollo suits. Here we go. And there's my friend Betty, another sew sister, Betty Smith in the back. And again, it's a close-up of some of the tooling that we use. Those are thrusters. The shuttle had 44, and the wooden tools that you see in the back were actually handmade by one of our engineers. And we would wrap our fabric around those wooden structures, put a spring tube at the very top. We'd drop the fabric in the middle and hand stitch all the way around the top. Put RTV, which is the red glue that you see at the bottom. RTV stands for room temperature vulcanization. We use that as a form of fray check to prevent our parts from fraying, to stabilize the base of a part if we were building, to install the shuttle tiles and blankets. We used RTV for a lot of things. But I was always so fascinated how something as basic as a wooden piece of tooling, and unfortunately, when the program ended, I found out they threw all the tooling away, and I think they're little pieces of art in itself. And it was disappointing when I found out that they threw them away.
Oh,
I
yes.
know, what a mess. Mess. Now, what you see here, you can begin to see some of the blankets. This is forward. The nose would be on the left-hand side of the picture, but that's just some of the examples of the thrusters. Those two thrusters that I showed you, the forms, those are the thrusters that you see here. Shuttle had 44 of them, and again, completely done by hand. Our failure rate for our parts were generally 5%, but when we were building thrusters, it was closer to 12%, because after we draped the fabric and hand stitched around the top of it and put the RTV at the bottom, we had to enclose the whole structure into a reverse mold and let the RTV dry for 4 days. And it wasn't until it was taken out of the tooling if we knew it was going to pass or not, because you have to use finesse as how much you're tightening it to make sure you're not squeezing it too much. Um, Quality would take it out of the mold, use calipers to measure the thickness of the RTV. If it was too thick, it got scrapped. If it was too thin, it got scrapped. And if we squeezed it too tight and we went above our stitch line, we were allowed 10% of RTV to go above a stitch line, but beyond that, the part had to be scrapped. So a lot of nuances to that one. That's why the failure rate for that one was 12%. Again, you don't find out till roughly 4 days after the part dries whether it's going to pass inspection or not. It's gray because we have a special paint called a mittens coating. And even though the fabric that we use is about as fireproof as you can get, of course, it's very hot in those areas there. So we used to call that our Pillsbury certification, meaning that we would weigh the part, paint one layer of mittens coating on it, bake it at 350 degrees, take it out of the oven, weigh it, put a second coat of mittens coating on it, weigh the part again, and then do another baking at 175 degrees, and then the part would have its final weigh. And if you're wondering why we weigh it, it's because quality needs to know that we put the appropriate amount of a mittens coating on the part, and the only way you can do, excuse me, is do that is to weigh the part when it's completed. Oh, this is one of the neatest blankets we did. It's called an arrowhead blanket, and it's a 5-day blanket done completely by hand. Very critical blanket. It's the only blanket that's on her belly. And I'm going to bring up my little shuttle. You can see we attached it literally right here. We had 3 attachment points on the external tank. This would be the upper attachment point on the external tank. In the center of that circle is where the actual probe would be, in the center of the top point. And it has a special reinforced carbon plate that covers it. I'm going to show a picture right here. I hope you can see it. I know there's glare. I don't know if you can see, but you can see, let me orient myself. Here we go. You can see right here the same shape of the blanket, and you can see the RCC panel that covers that. Otherwise, the blanket would fry as it came into reentry. I highlight this blanket. We had a situation back in 2009 that wasn't talked about very much, but we came very close to losing another space shuttle, and it involved this blanket. When we take off the external tank, we use explosive bolts on it. And it just so happens this one time, instead of the bolts going this way, it went straight up into the blanket. Now, the blanket was there for a couple of reasons to prevent that, but also before we had that blanket there, we would have explosive bolts and it would crack the tiles in that area. So this was also a form of sound suppression in that area. But again, it was life-saving. I didn't know something had happened until we had a lot of NASA personnel come up to our building. We're asking to look at the blanket, and we're taking all sorts of measurements. And eventually the blanket was slightly redesigned, but this is it in its glory. Again, a 5-day part, and its job is done in 8 minutes when it reaches orbit. I already did. Now here's a close-up. This is the nose landing gear. Again, we're talking right in this area here, but you can see where that correspond green area in the very middle, you can see that's where the blanket's installed. It's right in front of the nose landing gear door. And I enclosed that picture so you can get a better idea of where the blanket goes. Here we go. And speaking of nose landing gear doors, I would say maybe 75% of the work I did, if I went across the street, was forward. Occasionally, I worked back aft at the engines. But in this picture, which is one of the only few pictures I have me working, because NASA didn't really like us to have pictures of us working for security reasons. But when this was taken about 6 months before the program ended, and I said, I just want one picture so my grandkids that grandma really worked on the shuttle. So that's me sewing thermal barriers in. Those thermal barriers are 4 feet long. They're all done completely by hand. They have 2 spring tubes that run the length of them to allow us to flex them when we're putting them in. And you see me hand sewing them in. It would take 2 of us 18 hours to sew all 12 of them in. We had a curved needle, and you don't want to go too deep with your needle because that spring tube will cut it like a razor blade inside. And also, we had a special thread called AB 400 and 440, excuse me, and it was a very high melt thread. It melted at over 3,200 degrees. Only you would think a thread that could take that high a temperature would probably be a strong thread, but it's just completely opposite. I would be lucky enough to hand stitch an inch when the thread would start to fray, and I would have to stop, knot it in my part, and continue on. So the reason why it takes so long to stitch them all in is you're stitching an inch, stopping, stitching another inch, and stopping. And you're talking about 4.5 feet. And we have 3 on each wall, and all 3 of them have to be, all 12 have to be installed by hand. They would fly roughly 3 times. And if you're curious as how we would know it was time to change them out, Quality would literally take a piece of shim plastic that was probably the thickness of maybe 4 sheets of notebook paper. We would stick the piece of paper between the doors before we shut them. Quality would shut the door, and then we would take the piece of paper or shim plastic and move it. If we got any movement at all, that meant that the thermal barriers would have to be tightened even further to ensure that we had extremely tight-fitting doors. And the reason why is people are under the mistaken situation that they think it's the bottom of the shuttle that's the hottest on reentry, but it's actually in this area and right underneath her nose. And I'm going to show that next. There we go. Well, I have to digress. The picture up top is me pointing out my pink stitches inside the Udvar-Hazy when I spoke back in 2016, and they asked me to come back in 2024. I always joke, Grandma has stitches in the Smithsonian, and how many grandmas can say that? But they let me step over the platform so that I could stick my finger up and so I could point out, because I was the last one to sew Discovery's thermal barriers in her wheel well before she got sent up to Udvar-Hazy. That was an honor too. And there's another picture of me with the right fabric, and you can see, I jokingly say that it was kind of shaped like the state of Ohio. Kind of neat. And then you can see me holding a picture at the bottom. Here we go. Oh, and here, let me speak about Lurch. How I mentioned earlier how we had the tradition of naming all of our sewing machines. Lurch is a Singer, a 9710, built in 1914. And surprisingly, we had 3 of these sewing machines upstairs between 1914 and 1917. Lurch happened to be our oldest one, and we use Lurch for a number of activities up there. When I talk about the blankets, you'll notice that there'll be 2 rows of what we call closeout stitching. Lurch did that on the blankets. He also quilted our blankets for the back of the engines. So I have this picture here because this is what Lurch looked like when we got him at Kennedy, and this is what Lurch morphed into. Do you see? What a huge difference. So the green wheel that you see in the middle, that's how I raised my needle. And you see the picture from the previous slide, and you see in the bottom right-hand corner, that's what Lurch looked like. And this is what Lurch looked like when we were finished. We had to take a section of his arm off, add about 4 feet to the machine, weld it back together, and that's what Lurch morphed into. Now, we get asked often, well, gee, with all these modern sewing machines, I think people who are into history, as you all are, people recognize the quality of good old-fashioned heavy metal machines. These machines, their original jobs were sewing through leather, 2-3 inches of leather to build saddles. And so when we're sewing the engine blankets, called dome heat shield blankets, I'm sewing through 3 layers of Cerachrome, which almost looks like a green-gray particle board, and I have to cut it out with an X-Acto blade, but it's hard as a rock. So you've got 3 layers stacked with fabric in between, and Lurch is strong enough to be able to go through all that. So those old-fashioned machines are very powerful and very strong compared to the mainly plastic sewing machines are built of today. So there's our dome heat shield blankets. Those are the biggest blankets that we built for Shuttle. Those blankets are 8.5 feet across, take us roughly 4 days a piece, because if you look closely, and I know it's kind of difficult, there's actually 4 blankets on each engine. We've got the 2 dome heat shield blankets, which are the big C shapes. And then if you look closely, there's 2, almost like oh, it's shaped like a, what do they call that? Not keystone. It's a keystone. Oh, I forgot. It's a keystone shape. That would take us roughly 4 days. And they're called a splice pillow blanket because we hand fold a flat sleeving and make little belt loops. And we actually tie all 3 of those, loop all 4 of the blankets together. So what's amazing is what I love about it. Lurch not only quilts these blankets, we hand sew a 4-inch sleeving. Anybody who sews a bias tape is how you finish off an edge with another piece of fabric to encase it so that there's no fraying. Ours is made out of ceramic, and we would hand sew that on. And Lurch would actually, after we stitched them all the way around, Lurch would do a 1/4-inch top stitch around it to make sure all those threads were anchored in. But what the most amazing part about this blanket is how we installed it. I think people literally, their jaws drop when I tell them we actually hand sewed those on to the back of the shuttle with an Inconel wire thread. And it would take 2 of us roughly 8 hours to stitch one of the blankets on, or all the whole set. I get people often ask me, "Hey, Jean, are you climbing up there sewing up the blanket?" And I went, "No, no. We have a circular table that we put the blankets on, and 2 of us are hand sewing them on. There's a structure that goes underneath that, and we've got the tile. Then that structure goes on, then the blanket goes on. But on that structure, there's a hole about every 1/4 of an inch." And that's how we're able to take our curved needles with our wire thread and physically hand sew those blankets onto the back of the shuttle. There's a close-up, and again we take our quartz sleeving, and it's 4 inches thick, and I fold it origami style, and I have to hand sew all those loops on the dome heat shields and on the splice pillow. I used to remember the measurements, but we have 7 of them, and the blueprint tells us where exactly the distance they go, and then we just lace them on before we physically hand sew them on. It's a neat process. It's so cool to be able to say you work back there. So now we get to the real nitty-gritty. When people come up to see Atlantis, and I dare say when they see any of the space shuttles, first thing or the comment that I usually get, they'll say to me is, "Oh, that can't be the real space shuttle. It's too clean, and it looks like it's made out of paper mache." And so I laugh because I know exactly what they mean. There's a process that we build the blankets. This happens to be the machine that we built it on. It's quite massive. It's 10 feet tall. It almost looks like a quilting loom. But we have in the very center of the machine, you see like a gray rectangle. That's our little storage area where we have about 3 gallons of WD-40 that we pour in there. And the needles are right below it. They're about 9 inches long with 2 inches up into the machine. And it takes roughly 3.5 minutes for the machine to quilt the blankets one way. What you see there is a full blanket coming out called a production unit or a PU, and the quilted fabric itself is roughly 30 by 30 inches. And I'm going to grab a piece. This piece has been heat cleaned because the fabric is normally beige, but this is a piece of quilted fabric right here. And it's nice and shiny because this piece has been heat cleaned. So this is quartz fabric. quartz thread, spun quartz batting, and the backing fabric is just plain old fiberglass. Now keep in mind, this has been heat cleaned, so it makes it nice and shiny, but it's usually a matte beige, light beige before we put it into heat cleaning. So the process here, we had 11 different classes or thicknesses of the blanket. This one happens to be at this thickness, roughly a class 4. It's about a half inch thick. The temperature range for that blanket was roughly about 650 to about 700 degrees. Surprising to most people that at least, I would estimate at least 50 to 60% of the blankets that cover the upper surface of shuttle was that class 4. It's surprising because it's relatively thin. But the blankets went up to 2 inches thick, which went to the ohms pod, which for those aren't familiar, the ohms pod is this area right here on the shuttle, right here. And the reason why they're 2 inches thick, some people will incorrectly guess it's because it's close to the engines, which I guess would make sense to someone who wouldn't know. But the reason why is the actual surface of the ohms pod is made out of a composite material, and NASA tells us that the skin can't be exposed to any temperatures higher than 350 degrees. So this blanket is a heavy one for us to do. It's 2 inches thick, but its blanket range temperature for that is roughly anywhere between probably 12 to 1350 degrees. And again, we always build a blanket for more than what we need temperature-wise. In that area, we'll probably only see anywhere between 7 and 900 degrees. But I tell you, working through this machine, the tension in those center needles, quilting through a class 11, the needles get very, very hot. And we're always listening for a tinking noise because as it's slowly quilting, if we hear a tink, then we know a needle's getting ready to break. And they're under such tension that it's mandatory to wear eye protection. It just is. Because we had a quality guy come in who insisted he didn't need glasses, but a needle broke and literally went across the room. So anyway, it's very important for safety reasons. Here we go. And this is some of the processing when I'm building a blanket. The formula is whatever class of blanket is the thickness of the blanket, plus we have to add 1.5 inches all the way around the edge. This picture you kind of can see, but what I have to do is I have to take the batting out of that area where I'm flipping the fabric over, but I have to hand knot all the way around the blanket where the threads intersect. And that's a process that takes a long time, especially if I'm working with a blanket that's a full PU that's 30 by 30 inches. Now, what was a godsend to us, 2 reasons for the blankets. Personally, I always refer to the shuttle as a woman's curvy body. A lot of curves. We had a lot of tile, all different shapes. It was very difficult in the really tight curve areas for us to do tile because we did a dice cut. But we had to cut the tile in a tic-tac-toe design to get the inner curvature that we needed. Once we switched to the blankets on the ohms pod, I'm going to grab my piece of fabric and you can see how flexible it was. We got that really nice curve and it was so much easier. We also, believe it or not, we took off over 7,000 white tile, replaced them with roughly 2,200 blankets in various thicknesses, and it saved us over 7,000 pounds. I can pick up a tile, pick up a blanket, and of course there's a huge weight difference, but the wonder of the blankets was, depending on the blanket, I could take a full PU and I could get the equivalent of anywhere between 10 and 25 tile in that same surface area. And that alone is time and weight savings because some of those tiles were very intricate in the shapes with beveled edges and everything else. There we go. Close up. Now, the area that I have circled, I had to put that in there because I get asked often, did we have to replace the blankets and the tiles after every flight? And I said, if we did that, we would never fly. We came up with the tile repair kit in our building that we could actually fix. Saved a lot of time there. But the blankets, endearingly, I always tell everybody, if you ever get a rip in the knee of your jeans and your mom or your dad or any of your friend would have to patch up your knee, that's exactly what we do to the space shuttle. So you see the patch there. Depending on how big the patch is, sometimes we would have to take a piece of the full quilted blanket and put it in a core and then cover it with a patch. But all those patches are hand sewn on. The process to build a blanket, and I'll be quick, we make our blanket, it goes across the street, it gets dropped in the cavity that it's going to go into. If it passes pre-fit, comes back across the street to us. We'll bake the blanket at 650 degrees for roughly 4 hours, and then we bump it up to 850 degrees for 2 more hours, burning out impurities, sizing, anything, because we want that fabric as porous as we can, because once the blanket gets glued on with the RTV, it gets coated with 2 coats of ceramic paint called C9. First a clear coat, and then 8 hours later a white one. And so with each subsequent flight, the blankets actually will darken, the tiles will lighten, and we can tell the age by looking at the color. I think that's why people think it looks like paper mache. But anyway, I'm going to quickly point out the blankets where you see the holes at, those are penetration holes. On the shuttle, any area that we had to have access to, the process that we used to do is we would take the blankets off, do the repair work, and put new blankets on. And then we switched to, and I have a blanket with penetration holes on it right here. I don't know if you can see the lighting. But also, these blankets are glued onto a composite surface. And I don't have to tell you, I can take this blanket and a same blanket without the composite base. This blanket is very heavy in proportion to a regular blanket. So we, at all costs, if we didn't have to do that, we didn't. Again, it was only in areas that we had to give access to. This is the forward reaction control system where this section is, where we would have to lift that section out and do repair work. So by just unbolting them and then putting them back on, we saved a lot of steps. There we go. That's a picture that I took. I'm very proud of. The lights had come up on Atlantis, and you can clearly see the blankets. That's a nice picture. I bring it because those 2 ovals that you see are semicircle. Those are the star tracker system on shuttle. It's kind of like where the earlier sea explorers would look to see the stars to find out where they were in the ocean. Well, the astronauts will pull that white panel back on our star tracker system to look at the constellations to find out where they are in space. But I selfishly put this picture in. Well, maybe not selfish, I'm proud. If you look at the bottom star tracker, you'll see a blanket right at the bottom of the opening. That's the blanket that I built for Atlantis. And it's a tricky blanket because it's less than ½ inch thick, and I'm coring 6 holes into it, which weakens the blanket. And I'm going from a ½ inch down, I'm tapering down to nothing as I get to the outermost rim of the star tracker. So there I have to take a flat sleeving and hand sew that on and still keep it structurally sound and as flat as I can get it. So after I finished and it went across the street to have its pre-fit, I got my traveler paperwork back and there was a smiley sticker on it. And I asked some of my ladies, well, I have no idea what that means. So I called over to the installation quality guy and he said to me, that's a really tough blanket to fit first time. And yours did it the very first time. So I thought you deserved a happy face sticker on your paperwork. So I thought that was very nice. There we go. And there's the ohms pods, a very good close-up. And again, when you see the darker blankets in the middle, we know those have been on her since her first flight of October 3rd of 1985. Again, tiles lighten, blankets darken. So all those darker blankets are been on her since 85. If you're wondering what the black markings are, that's ID. We each had our own letter and number sets that we would individually letter and number each little part. There's over 2 million shuttle parts, and we had 5 methods of how we ID'd our parts. This one started off as a gold ink, but in the process of heat cleaning, it turns it black. And if you're wondering why that ID goes on that particular side of the blanket, every blanket that we did, any part that we built, tiles included, it was oriented to the nose. So and each time we would put a little arrow telling the guys across the street, this is how the blanket goes, but they would know if the ID was on this one side, it faced the nose. Now, on occasion, if the part was too small, NASA allowed us to ID whatever side we could get it on, as long as we had the arrow that said, this is the way it goes. So I always thought that was fascinating, and I get asked that a lot. Where do we put the ID? Okay, I mentioned this in the book. They said I needed to put something exciting, so I decided to include this. So there's the book, and it's towards the end of the book. Anyway, we had it on STS 117. We actually had a blanket we noticed it peeled back when NASA started examining the blankets. For the first time, well, actually with 114, we actually had the robotic arm, and I have a picture of the process here in the book. There we go. We noticed that when we had the arm that panned the leading edge of the wing and also the whole orbiter, we noticed that we had a class 11, which again, that 2-inch thick blanket at the very top of the ohms pod. It would be right roughly in that area here. So we had a really exciting time that time. We hadn't fired up the multi-needle machine that made the blanket in probably close to a year. And NASA asked us to build and replicate that whole section of the shuttle with the blankets and the tile. So we had to make 4 test panels, and we had overnight to do it all. So we had to fire up the machine, build the blankets, and our guys downstairs put the tiles on it. We sent 4 samples to Houston to see if we could not get the blanket back into place. Would it cause a banana peel effect, and the blanket would peel and it would burn up in that area, or cause excessive heat, which is one thing we don't want. But anyway, we had John Olivas, who I was fortunate enough to meet him after the flight, and he came out and did the spacewalk, and we're watching NASA TV, and he has this little suture kit with this little teeny needle, and we're laughing at the TV saying, oh, if he thinks he's fixing that blanket, he's crazy. So he ended up using staples, and he has a big curved needle that he used. But I'm just thinking, it just, to me, it's just kind of neat because he had to use the same techniques that we had to do to repair it. And of course, what he ended up doing is after he stapled as best he could, he did what most of us would do. He took his 2 fingers and shoved the blanket down as hard as he could get it, and the shuttle made it home fine. In that area where you see the black and white tile, we affectionately call that the shuttle eyeball. So that gives you an idea. You can't see it on my model, but it's roughly right there. So that's inside the book. And like I said, it's been neat that I had a chance to meet him. And there's some more pictures of him in the spacewalk. You can see, if you look to the left of his head, you can see on top of the ohms pod where the blanket had peeled away. And anyway, it was just exciting to have a small part of that. And the 2 that I have here, another thing that we had something different. Steve Robinson and I was lucky enough to meet him too on STS 114, which most of you will know that was our return to flight after we unfortunately lost Columbia. He had to actually, we noticed 2 gap fillers hanging down from the bottom of the orbiter. And the type that he pulled is an Ames gap filler. This picture, 2 of these gap fillers that he pulled made it to the Smithsonian. I took this picture because Terry White came across the street. He was our bay manager. And when the shuttle came home, he said, you know, you ladies work thermal protection. I think you probably want to see these. So before they go to Smithsonian, I'm going to let you see these. Now, there's a world of difference between the 2 type of gap fillers. The one down at the bottom is an Ames. It's just ceramic. We use between 1 and 6 layers of fabric that I have a ceramic paint, which is, you see the gray there, and we'll stack it together and almost like a fiberglass. And when we go, and it's about maybe a 1/16 of an inch. When we go above that, then we go to what we build a pillow gap filler. And that's what we did mainly. The guys downstairs did the Ames gap fillers because that's just putting the fabric and the coating together. We have a bunch of hand sewing. We had thousands of gap fillers that we did, and the description is exactly what it did. It filled the gaps in between the tile. As you can see, it's hand sewn. The sleeving itself at the bottom is cording, but it's hollow. That's all done by hand. And if you look closely, you'll notice there's a French knot, which is a type of embroidery stitch. But every inch, we would have to stitch an inch, do a French knot, continue on and do another inch as we're sewing the sleeving onto the basic gap filler. Quality is looking for that French knot as part of the final step to buy it, because again, if any of that sleeving starts peeling away, that French knot prevents it from peeling off all the way. The gap fillers have Inconel foil in them. It looks like aluminum foil, but thicker. It's cadmium and nickel, and it's on a roll. That's like our interfacing to stiffen any of our parts. Um, RTV on the top to prevent it from fraying. And these go into a Stickney gauge to see how thick they are. Having a pillow gap filler is twofold. It prevents the tiles when they're coming home. They're vibrating, and so it protects the side walls of the tile. And also, again, every square inch of the shuttle has to have some sort of thermal protection. So that's why we built those. Here we go. And again, when I talked about working on the beanie cap, I'm in the upper left-hand side, and I don't know, you can see the gray walkway. Then you see the the beanie cap on top of the orange external tank, and that white like hose that you see. The part that's right next to the beanie cap is the soft part that I'm going up there and sewing. And you can see me at the bottom on the Atlantis display. We actually have the beanie cap where they took off the pad, and it's on display there. It's in the bottom first floor of the Atlantis exhibit, and you see it's pretty big, kind of scary. You go up there, and I would say a prayer when I got off the elevator because the stairway leading up to the beanie cap itself is very narrow, and I had my little work bag with me. I'm by myself and I'm working, but there were two other people up there, and it's kind of funny. Two people up there, and their only jobs were we had one that had a water hose and the other one had an air gun for some reason. And we've had a lot of shuttles that had to go back to the VAB. The bird population that we have, since Kennedy's a wildlife area, they have pecked the dickens out of some of those external tanks. Don Thomas, who's a good friend of ours, was an astronaut on STS-70. He has a book that he talks about how there were thousands of divots that woodpeckers had pecked inside the external tank. They thought they could fix it on the pad and couldn't, so they had to roll the book back. I mean, excuse me, they had to roll the shuttle back to get it repaired. In fact, if you're lucky enough, they had a special crew patch designed that had Woody the Woodpecker on it, which we think is funny. But anyway, that's what their job is. They try to scare the birds away, so that's their only job is with the air gun and the hose, and they're not allowed to listen to music. That's all their job is. They sit there. I can talk with them while I'm up there working, but that's what they have to do for their 8-hour shift. And the other picture that I have in the middle, we ladies also built the old slide wire baskets. They have new ones now, but we actually built the fabric part, not the framework, but the fabric of the slide wire baskets that in case if the astronauts had to do emergency egress, they would just, let me grab some water, they would just tap a button. Excuse me, they would just tap a blanket, or I should say slap it, and they would slide down going about 60 miles an hour to be caught at the base in a big net. Thank goodness that never had to happen in real life. And there's a close-up of my work. You can see the beanie cap. You can see the pleated hoses. Ken was nice enough to take the pictures for me so you can get some really detailed photo. Like I said, the closest I can describe it, it looks like a dryer hose vent. But again, it had to be fixed every so often because heat and humidity is brutal on our fabric out there. Yes, it's like 210 feet up there, and it's just, it's it's scary, but it's beautiful once you get up there. The water is beautiful up there. Oh, I am afraid of heights. Anyway, so for any of you who've never been here, a must-view place to go to is Spaceview Park. It's right on the river. You can see the VAB, the launch pads. It's a beautiful site. They have a tribute to all the major space programs that NASA has done. We've got Gemini and you name Mercury, Shuttle. And so I was honored enough that my name, I'm standing with my book, but if you look in the upper right-hand corner of the design, my name is up there. So my name will be up there forever, and it's quite an honor. And in the bottom, you can see just exactly, this is a little pavilion at the park, and you can see just how close we are from there to see all the launches up there from Kennedy. So there's my book, some of my favorite pictures. The one in the middle, that's me in my little green smock. And the lady that you see in the picture on the left, that's Mrs. Hansford. She was a woman who was my next door neighbor when I lived in Michigan. she never had any children. So she took the time to teach my sister and I not only how to sew, but we saw our first steam iron for the first time. She taught us how to match plaid fabric. And for some people, they say, well, what's the big deal? You know, you're a mark of a good seamstress if you can take the side seam of any garment, and if the plaids match perfectly, then you know it's a high quality garment. And she taught us the techniques on how to do that. And when the book came out, I knew she was older. I had a hard time finding her, but I eventually found her. Mrs. Hansford turned 93 this past August, so she's still alive. And my twin sister Joan is also in the picture. She actually had a chance to travel to Michigan last year, showed Mrs. Hansford the book, and she actually cried because she said, "I never in my wildest dreams ever thought I would be inside of a book." And she says that she was always so proud of my sister and I. I'm just glad she's still alive. Okay. Okay, and it's okay. So right here I have Pam Melroy, who's our deputy administrator at NASA. I was so lucky. We had a book signing in the Smithsonian, and by happenstance, she went into the gift shop and said I didn't know she saw my book. So there's a woman named Jennifer Ross, and she's the one in Texas that writes all the official NASA oral history. So apparently, which I didn't know, Ms. Melroy sent her an email and said, "I just saw this book. I'm so interested in the story. You have to find her and do an NASA oral history on her." So I've been working on that since March. It's almost completed. We go back and forth with editing and everything else, but that's an honor. I mean, yes, I had a small part in the program, but just to be honored with the idea that huge people with NASA's history has been asked to do it, and I can't believe that she asked me to do one. Yes, she's also was the shuttle's second female commander, of course, with Eileen Collins being the first. I've had a chance at the press site to meet her a couple of times. She's a nice lady. And speaking of awards, see, I'm kind of uncomfortable. Ken insisted I put this in here. I gave a speech to the Daughters of the American Revolution in Washington, D.C., and they honored me with an award called Women in American History. And a lot of prestigious people have gotten it, like Sally Ride, RGB from the Supreme Court, you name it. And I told them I didn't think I ranked up with that status of ladies, but they said you did. With what you did for the shuttle, you helped bring the astronauts home safely. There was just a small group of you ladies, and we were so fascinated with the speech that you gave us. And they said, we thought you were the perfect choice for us to get this award. So they came down from Washington, D.C., came down to the Atlantis exhibit, which you can see in the background, and they presented me with the award, I'm just so honored that they did that for me. Yes. And anyway, here, put that down. It's okay. I'll show that later. You can see Ken and I are now launch photographers. We get to go all sorts of neat places. This is when Artemis had its first rollout a few years back. We were out there for 8 hours taking pictures, and it was almost 100 degrees that day. Very hot. We look hot because we are. But again, just having a small part of the shuttle program, continuing on as a docent, I get to keep my NASA badge. So I get to do VIP tours. I get to still go inside and on the roof of the VAB. And as a photographer, I get to set up remote cameras. We get to meet a lot of neat people. It's just a blessing. I mean, I literally thank God every day that I even got hired, because I never knew this little girl from Michigan would ever get a chance, that I always wanted to work on the program somehow. Here we go. There we go. And that's a close-up. You see how red Kent's face is? And there's Bill Nelson in the left-hand corner. Of course, Jarek Isaacman has been he's our NASA administrator, and we've met him a number of times. And of course, in the new administration, Jared Isaacman will be, if he passes muster, which I'm sure he will. We've met him on a number of times too, and he's a very soft-spoken, very modest man. I really like him. I hope it works out, but we really like him. We really like him. So there's some examples. There's the Artemis launch. That night, I was on top of the CBS building with Peter King, who's radio, CBS radio. We were on the CBS building. He had his arm around me. The launch was like at 1:30 in the morning. It was just a very exciting night. It was so loud and so bright. The building is rumbling, and Peter says to me, "Oh, Jean, if this continues much longer, you and I will find ourselves on the first floor." It was very loud, very bright, but beautiful. We all had a hard time. This picture that you see during Atlantis' launch, that's as doctored up as we could get it. We put filters, we do everything we can to bring that brightness down, but the launch was so bright, no matter how much we tried to correct the pictures, that was as best as we could get it. Here we go. Oh, let me go back real I just mentioned that. Okay, I see the tile there. We have the Orion capsule. Our building built the tile. Excuse me, let me get some more water. Our building helped build the tile for that. Sorry, I can tell I'm around the blankets because I always get fuzz down the back of my throat when I have a fib out, which is what that blanket's called. Here we go. And so this right here is the end of my talk, but I have this final picture in here. This is Endeavor's, her last flight. I'm up on the pad. I'm underneath the external tank, and you see itty bitty me underneath the external tank. The tank's 185 feet tall. And when I originally developed the picture, it was only 4x6 and you could barely see me. So I blew the picture up to 8x10 and then you could see me underneath there. So anyway, again, we get to go in the crew quarters. There's a lot of things that we have access to, and it's just been an honor to have a part of this. So I'm pretty much finished.
Show that picture. You were just in the
Okay. Ken said to show this, and this will be tough. I don't know if you can
Good.
see.
That's good.
See this? Here we go.
Yeah.
I'm literally looking through the New York Times on Sunday, and I'm flipping through. Here, move it. Here we go. There you go. You see it? There we go. They can see it. That's
Okay.
good. Anyway, so I'm flipping through it, and I'm looking at it, and I said, I think that's me. And it was. So
For the Europa.
for the Europa Clipper, and the gentleman to the right of me, I had just put my camera down because we're next to the countdown clock there. Just put my camera down because Bob Cabana always had a good saying for us. He always says, for you photographers and anybody who's watching a launch, either the first or 100th time, put your phone down. Put your camera down. I want you to seal that in your brain that you will always remember what a launch looks like. So as soon as it took off and I could see the contrail, I put my camera down. But our friend to the right of me is our friend named Rob. He's a photojournalist from the Netherlands who came for the launch, and he's a good friend of ours. So he's also to the right of me in the picture. So that completes my talk. So I'm anxious to answer any questions if anybody has any. So thank you for taking the time to listen. Thank you.
Oh, this was wonderful, Jean. I had just so many questions, and we do have a number of questions in the chat as well.
Oh, good.
One thing just to kick off the questions, I'm curious about how you got hired at NASA, and I know we've heard stories of when the original Apollo like EVA suits were constructed, and the ladies at Hamilton State or at
You're right. Hamilton
Dover.
Standard in Connecticut. No, both of them did.
Okay.
Both of them, both companies, but the major contract was ILC Dover. And because, as I call my NASA badge, my golden ticket, because I'm NASA badge, I'm allowed to go in their sewing room because that's a strict area. And I've been twice at ILC Dover.
Oh, that's
Yes.
exciting. When you were hired, though, did they have like a test, like a sewing test,
See,
or
you're going to be surprised how people say, "Oh, you must have seen an ad in the paper," and I don't know how they got around because that's just not true. It's just not true. They were doing a return to flight series in our local newspaper, Florida Today, and I knew the shuttle had fabric pieces that were sewn. I didn't know, to be honest, what the extent. And in the book, in the newspaper, there was a picture of a woman who I eventually found out was Pilar Ryan. And she was from Spain, and her husband worked on the shuttle, and that's how she got her job there. without even knowing, but I wrote her on email and I said, you don't know me from Adam, but I said, I'm curious as to what you need for the job. And she told me, of course, you knew how to sew. But what's surprising to people is we have to know how to read blueprints because that's how we're building our parts. I'm looking at a blueprint and I have to take a piece of Mylar and draw exactly what the blueprint looks like, my pattern that quality has to stamp and buy before I can even build my part. So I'm backtracking. But anyway, so I filled out an application and I waited for 6 months and didn't hear anything. I tweaked it and redid it over again at the end of the year. And in January, the beginning of January, it was within 5 days after I submitted my second resume, I had a call on caller ID that said Kennedy Space Center, and I thought someone was playing a cruel joke because they knew how much I wanted to be there. But it was them calling for an interview. So I had an interview. And it was, believe it or not, on Ken's birthday before I knew him, January 24th. And it was a 2-hour interview in front of 4 people. And I had to answer all these questions. And I had studied NASA TV, the schedule, learned up everything I could on thermal protection. So when I was asked questions, I would know what I was talking about. So what I didn't know is after my interview, I knew there were 3 ladies after me to be interviewed. And then they told me when I left, they said, hey, Debbie, we want you to take Jean out to the hangar. Our building had had hurricane damage from a spun off tornado and blew the building roof off our building. So the ladies were building shuttle parts, unfortunately, in the white hangar that they put the Columbia parts in when they were reassembling her after we lost her. So the tape was still on the floor, the grid work, when I went in there. But I didn't know until a couple days later, I got a call that said Kennedy Space Center on the ID again. And it was my boss telling me that I had gotten the job. And he said to me, you know, we had a lot of loss in our building, a lot of sadness. And he said, you were the brightest spark. We were amazed at your knowledge. You knew how to sew. That was a given. But he said, the passion you had, we could see that every time we heard you talk and the excitement. And he said, we knew you would be just what our building needed. And I said, I can't believe that compliment. Even now, it still kind of gives me chills because he said to me, and he told me afterward, he told the other people who interviewed me, I'll listen to the other 3 ladies, but I've already made up my mind and I want her. So
Oh,
that was cool.
wow, that's awesome.
It's
Mhm.
in the book too.
Yes, it is in the book. Would you stop? Stop. Stop it. Any
So,
other questions?
yeah, there are a couple questions in the chat, and a number of them from actually a fellow docent of mine at the Air and Space Museum, Joe Romito, who's
Oh.
incredibly knowledgeable about the shuttle and has helped me learn about it as well. But he has a couple questions. The first is he was curious about when you were talking about the cloth from the Wright Flyer,
Mhm.
and was curious about how Armstrong was allowed to keep fabric from the flyer or how he acquired that swath of fabric.
Um, of course, I've been to Dayton in the museum up there with all the Wright stuff that they have. There was a commandant up there, an Air Force. I'm Navy. I think it's a commandant. I don't know what the Brigadier General. It was some high person. He said Neil Armstrong actually wrote him and said, I want an homage to the Wright brothers because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have progressed this far. So he wrote them and got permission from, I think it was a Brigadier General at the Air Force. Um, what's it called? It's not a museum. There's a Air Force, I think it's a museum up there, but
Dayton.
he asked specifically for a piece of fabric to be sent. And so he put it in what he calls his PPK, personal preference kit, that the astronauts even now are only allowed about 5 pounds worth of personal goods. So he took that with him. So that was what he did. He wanted an homage to the Wright brothers. So it's in the history. And about the fabric, which I love, it's called Pride in the West fabric, and back then, at the time, was one of the most expensive fabrics you could get. It's a type of muslin, but it's very, very tightly, finely woven. They used to use it for ladies' undergarments. It was very soft, but again, you want really tight thread, so you get that the airlift. And
Mhm.
so it's funny, doing research on it, they said that the ladies used to come and watch the Wright brothers build the plane, and they would just cluck, cluck, cluck. What a waste, that all that expensive fabric being wasted on something that would never fly. And they used
about 125 yards of it. And there was a store called Wright Kimmler in Dayton, Ohio, that they bought the fabric from at a department store. Orville was the one that did the marking, Wilbur did the sewing. And what I love about it is when I was cutting the fabric, and I forgot to mention this, I had on high power glasses because I had to be very precise in how I cut the fabric. And as I was cutting it at a 45-degree angle, which for people who don't sew don't mean anything, the finished side is a selvage of fabric. But when you have a 45-degree and you pull it, you get the most stretch. So we even cut our parts for Shuttle at a 45-degree angle because when you're going around a curve, it gives a nice smooth surface. And the fabric came from the left wing of the Wright Flyer, and that's the same techniques that we used on Shuttle, cutting on the bias. So Orville must have marked it with a pencil. I could see a fine line at a perfect 45-degree angle. So I said to the people at the auction house, you got something special here on this piece of fabric. And they said, we don't know what you're talking about. So I said, I have these really strong glasses and I can see this faint pencil line. So apparently they marked it exactly how we did Shuttle at that perfect 45-degree angle to get us that stretch. I mean, I can go like that and you can kind of see, but whenever you're working on curve, every fabric has to be on bias because you get a nice smooth surface on a curve. And I just smile because we use the same techniques that they did too.
Oh, very cool.
Mhm.
Another question. The folks that worked in the thermal protection building that made the tiles,
Mhm.
were they contractors or NASA employees?
We were all contractors. We worked for United Space Alliance. Some
Okay.
of our paperwork, probably some of them may have been, we had Lockheed Martin, McDonnell Douglas, which we used to draw their drawings, MacDax. We had to learn, all of them had different symbols, and so we had to learn all their styles of blueprint because when we did a pattern, we had to mark where the ID tag would go, where the basting would go, everything. So there was a lot of detail into making them. In fact, even before I could even start a part, you guys might find this interesting, because the shuttle program went for over 30 years or close to 30 years. We had what we called EOs or engineering orders. So I would get a folder or a traveler, as we called it, and inside would be a list of what fabrics we needed and all the changes that may have happened as the part was being built. So there were times I would have to read through at least 60 pages of engineering orders to see if the thread had changed, to see if the blanket thickness had changed, to see if anything had changed. And I had to read all that before I could even make my pattern, before I could even start building my part.
Oh man. Wow.
Hmm.
Um, kind of an ancillary question about the tiles.
Hmm. I
They have
should have brought
tiles
them. I have them upstairs. I have them upstairs.
They have tiles on spaceship, or I'm sorry, on Starship. Is that correct? Do
Yes,
you
they
know anything?
do. Yes, I do know about that because 3 years ago, my main manager, Martin, who is the manager of our whole building, and Jeff Andrus, who is our lead engineer, 3 years ago, were asked by SpaceX to leave our TPSF and start working for them. So Martin said, you know what? Program's done. We've done what we can. And when SpaceX offers you double the amount of pay, you work for SpaceX. So yes, they think both of them have worked on the hexagon shaped ones. And what's interesting is they don't glue them on with RTV like we do. Now, in some areas, he says they might have had to because he can't talk about a lot of things. They don't use gap fillers like we do. The Nomex felt that we used for some of our padding on the shuttle, they would use that underneath the tile. But what they do is they clip their tiles on. They're called bayonet clips, and the tiles just snap right on. They don't
Wow.
glue them. They don't glue them like we do on shuttle. But like he says, it's a bear to get them off. And what we did is we did the same thing with shuttle. We would just put a protective piece around the tile, and then we would just hammer them out
Yes.
carefully. But you hammer them out and you take the pieces out, and that's how they take the Starship tile off too.
Wow. Interesting.
Mhm.
Um, another question about the dome heat shield blankets. How often did they have to be replaced?
Generally, that's a good question. Generally, it depends on what part, 3 flights generally, but with that one, that caveat to that one is if you look at the blankets, we have blanket A and B. A is the left side blanket, B is the right. And it seemed funny. Engine number one, well, this is going to be hard if I can see. Engine number one is this one. Two is on the left side. three is on the right. So one, two, three. If we were going to lose a blanket, it was always the top blanket, engine one, and it generally was on side B. We don't know why, because whenever we say, "Hey, you guys have got to take another blanket over there," we'd say 1B. It always was, and a lot of that had to do with any type of contamination, be it a little fuel, extra singeing, would require that blanket to come off. So most of the times three. But those blankets we were constantly building, and we had these giant wooden coffins that we would stick the blankets in when we were done. They would go across the street for storage, and then they would be installed. But yeah, roughly three times. But if it was engine number one, it was always that one. I don't know why, but it was always that one.
Wow, interesting. Um,
Mhm.
Question about the composition of the pads and blankets on the top and side of the shuttle.
Mhm.
Most of that was Nomex, is that correct? Or there were what
Well,
other materials were
oh,
used?
I should have brought a piece. We had a piece of felt, I'm glad you asked, called frizzy. And if you look at the ultra smooth parts of the shuttle, be it the top of the payload bay doors, top of the wings, and down the side of the shuttle, and the top of the crew compartment, it's a quarter inch, between a quarter and half-inch piece of Nomex felt with a white elastomer coating, which is white, and it's just a brownish piece of Nomex felt that would be glued right onto the surface. That saved us 1,000 pounds. That has a temperature range of up to 750. So the blankets between 650 and 1300, no, the Nomex Frizzy flexible reusable surface insulation, that's what it's called, Frizzy. That saved us 1,000 pounds too. So we do have felt, yes, we do. And I neglected to show, if I can find it, we ladies also built the blankets inside the payload bay. This is beta cloth, which is the same fabric that the exterior of the spacesuits are. Huge difference, though. If you look at a really close shot of an astronaut spacesuit, you'll see like a little quarter-inch grid that's from the back because it's called ortho fabric. They have Kevlar thread that's in a quarter-inch grid that's behind the white fabric to make the fabric strong. Now, we don't have that on here, but this blanket that I have here, polyamide on the back, Beta on the front, which is a Teflon coated fiberglass. We've got grounding wire here. I don't know if you can see. Tricky about this blanket is if I'm putting a snap on it, we had a wire bobbin thread for this one. So if I'm putting a snap on it, I had to make sure that the prongs didn't break a stitch because the final step to buy this blanket, quality would have to take an ohms reader on my stitch line and it would have to arc to make sure it was grounded. We don't want static or sparking in the payload bay. This blanket, we made two of this. If I made a blanket this shape, I built one with batting in between. That was called this one's an MLI for multi-layer, and then the other was a TCS with layers of batting. And we had over 5,500 of those blankets in silver that you won't see. This polyimide film protected the astronauts from radiation. We can date, in these, there's about 2,200 of white ones. So we made all these. We made the 5,500 silver blankets that went in the bulkheads and underneath the white blankets. But this is what it looks like inside an MLI. I cut one away. I don't know if you can see all those layers. There's about
Wow.
22 layers of Dacron mesh, and we have our film. And the reason why we have our bridal tooling, as we call that, or scrim, you never have metal touching metal. So we have all these layers, and then we have solar shield. Some of our blankets had solar shield. Apollo, you might recognize that.
Yeah, yep.
We have that on Apollo too. But these blankets, of course, get exposed to sun. We can date the blankets because, believe it or not, for the first 4 years of the shuttle program, all the silver blankets that we have were made out of a blend of 24 karat gold. So we can date with blankets. As the shuttles were having their tune-ups or OMPDs in California, they would come back. Thousands of gold blankets would come back for us to rebuild them into polyimide blankets. Polyimide is cheap. It's anti-corrosive, protects the astronauts from radiation, but a hell of a lot cheaper than gold. So we know Columbia and Challenger, if we got gold blankets, we know that's where they came. And darn it, I forgot. I have one upstairs. Anyway, it's a gold blanket. NASA calls those historical blankets, and they're pretty gold. They're a very pretty blanket. But again, gold got so high so that we switched and switched to polyimide.
Wow.
So anyway.
How about from one mission to the next, how much time did your team spend on readying shuttle?
That's a good question. And Atlantis holds the record for that one. But there's a huge caveat to that. When the shuttle lands and when she gets ready to launch again, that's called the flow period. The time-consuming part, and people forget about this, is the shuttle tiles and the blankets are very porous. We have to waterproof every single time she comes home. We started off with 32,000 tile before we switched to blankets, and now we're down to 25,000 tile roughly. You've got 2,200 blankets, and all of them have to be waterproofed. Funny story. First shuttles, we have thermocouples in all of them. We still do to give a temperature range of the tile because we didn't know exactly what temperatures they'd be exposed to. So we found out at an STS-1 that the waterproofing solution that they used on the tile was not lasting. It was burning out when it re-entered. So until they came up with a new formula, STS 2, 3, and 4 had tons and tons of cans of Scotch Guard that we sprayed on the tile to waterproof them until we could come up with a formula. We use what we call DMES,
Yeah.
dimethylethyloxylane, say that a million times. Um, but the tile, we have, if they have little holes in them, we have a needleless gun that we shoot the waterproofing in. The other ones that they're vaporized in as the tiles are being built. The blankets themselves, we have a needle of DMES that we inject every 4 inches in all 2,400 blankets. So that alone, waterproofing, takes tons of time. On average, we were 6 to 9 months in a flow. Atlantis has the record of less than 2 months. And begin with that caveat. She had gone to California, had her complete tune-up, her OMPD, orbiter processing, where they redid everything on her. And the only thing she had to have done was her waterproofing of her tile. And that took 2 months. So she holds the record for the shortest flow time because most of that work had been done in California, but that's unheard of at Kennedy. Just
Oh,
unheard of.
wow.
It's unheard of.
Well, a little fun fact, two fun facts about the materials on the exterior of the shuttle that have ties to southeastern Pennsylvania. So the waterproofing material actually is manufactured by a chemical company in Morrisville, Pennsylvania.
Oh, cool.
I recently found that out. And also the Nomex, and I think I've told you this before, the Nomex material, that was actually the heat filament itself was developed by DuPont, of course, but it was actually
Whoa.
operationalized by the Navy by a female biophysicist who worked at the Naval Air Development Center in Warminster. So she's
Wow.
credited with actually sort of the inventing Nomex as a fabric.
Oh,
And
that's fascinating.
our organization actually helped to get her inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame this past May. So
Well,
a
that's
very
wonderful.
well-deserved
Thank you.
honor.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
So yeah. So
But
I
I
know
find,
I'm
I'm
sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
I was just going to say, my spiel is Ken and I go, we do a lot of outreach. My thing is with the kids because I was all right in math and science. I'm a creative person. I love to sew, paint, quilt, you name it. And a lot of people think that NASA doesn't require creative-minded people. NASA looks for out-of-the-box thinkers, I should say. And I have a craft that literally has been done for thousands of years. And it's amazing to me that we can prove that the Egyptians did it, and still thousands and thousands of years later, we need it to build spacecraft. In fact, one of our neatest shirts we ladies had made was never underestimate the power of women who build spacecraft. So we took pride that we had parts to do that. But again, speaking with the kids who maybe not be good in math or science, I tell them, look, we need people who know how to draw to come up with our new concepts and designs, people who know how to write, people like me who know how to sew. I said there's a spot for everybody in NASA, and I try and encourage the kids that they're really, if you want to, and I know it's cliche if you work hard enough. My son used to tell me all the time when he was a teenager, everybody tells you that story. If you work hard enough, you'll succeed if you dream hard enough. And he said, I never believed it until the day I came home and you told me that you had gotten a job on the space shuttle. Because he said, I knew that's what you wanted from the time you were 13. And he goes, and I finally believed if it happened to my mother, then I know it can really happen.
Sure.
So that made a lot to hear him say that.
Oh. I do want to also share and then we can go ahead and wrap up. But Marcy Frumker, I don't know if she's still online, but she joined this evening and she actually put in the chat, great book, Jean. I picked up a copy at Kennedy when I visited last April. Love
Oh,
your and Ken's social media space posts and thank you both for your dedication.
that's
Um,
very kind.
Yep. And my colleague Joe Ramito actually commented that I knew the shuttle was an incredibly complex machine, but you've added tremendous details to that complexity. Amazing.
Oh, well, thank you. Oh,
And
I
I
tell
will,
you, anybody who comes down, I'd be more than happy to give them a personal walkthrough with my little pointer and point out anything when they come down to visit.
oh, there we go. So everybody, we have to have a road trip down to Kennedy. I've been meaning to get down there again myself. I haven't been in a long
Oh, we've
time.
added a lot of new things there, a lot of new exhibits now.
That'd
Yes,
be great.
Lectures for groups.
yes, yes.
And I do have
I'm
one
sorry.
last question that
Okay.
actually Alyssa had asked. She was curious about, did you retire when the shuttle program ended, or, what was that transition from
I
NASA or as a
did.
contractor to your,
I was asked if I wanted to stay for the other programs, and I could have, but you know what? I'm thinking, you know, um, we were there sometimes, but include my drive time, 14-hour days, not all the time. But I thought nothing could top working on the shuttle. I mean, yes, excitement working on the new programs, but it was something working on the shuttle was always a dream of mine, and I didn't think anything, I know that sounds arrogant, but I didn't think anything could top that. So I wanted to end. We were considered critical skills, and so we stayed to the very end. We're three layoffs, three groups of layoffs. I was there to the very end because our jobs obviously were considered critical skills, and it was very critical.
absolutely.
Mhm.
Well, I know we're definitely at time, and I want to really sincerely
Okay.
thank you. This was a wonderful end to our 2024 schedule, speaker schedule. So thank you for your time this evening. And
You have, what do you,
I do want to just give a plug to everyone. Two things. If you're interested, you have to buy Sew Sister, Jean's book, and
yeah.
also join us next month for the beginning of our 2025 lecture schedule with George Leopold starting on January 9th. So I want to thank everybody and have a great, happy holiday season. And stay safe, and we will hopefully see you in January. So
One more
thanks
thing.
Let
again.
me just mention
yes.
one more thing. Yeah.
Sorry. What?
Anybody interested in the book or having Jean give a talk, contact her.
Okay.
Okay, and then you'll get an autographed copy instead of one from Amazon that doesn't have an autograph.
Or you
Okay.
can get one at the Smithsonian or down
The other thing is this Sunday, December 15th, Jean will be talking about the award that she just got, and me.
Oh,
We
that's
will be on ABC Orlando, and that's going to be a watch live link, and we'll be able to send that to you. It's a half-hour show at 12:30. And the final thing I want to say is since you're a Cold War group, I don't know if your folks know this, but the Soviets built a space shuttle also called Buran.
Buran, yes.
It
Oh, yeah.
launched one time, okay,
It's a
and
bunch of
that was
shows.
it, and unmanned,
Mhm.
and it's on display a little bit decrepit in Germany right now. But I
now.
think that's important for you as a Cold War group
Yes.
to know the Soviets had a shuttle program too.
Yes.
All
Yeah,
right.
Yes, and they
absolutely.
said they probably stole the technology from us.
But they
That's
were
right.
running out
But
of
they
money, and that's
but they
why
didn't
they
steal the seamstresses. We had the
No,
great seamstresses.
no. All right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you again for the opportunity. And thank you for everybody to stay and listen. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much again. And I
Merry
think it,
Christmas, everyone.
yes, Merry Christmas, Happy
Okay.
Holidays, and
Okay.
hopefully we will see folks in January. So thanks again. Take
All
care.
right. Thanks again. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.